Well, thank you very much, Aida-san. It's difficult to keep any personal secrets when you have a reporter who is your moderator. So, but it's a wonderful pleasure for Diane and me to be back here in Japan with friends and many of you who are interested in these topics. And just a few days ago, I was in Washington, D.C., walking through those shimmering white rows of cherry trees that Japan gave to the United States many years ago. They were in full bloom at that time, and all who saw them were filled with this wonderful wonder at their annual miraculous appearance. They remind us of the U.S.-Japan relationship, and at the same time, they transcend that relationship into wider concepts of nature that are universal. But the history of the Washington cherry trees, like the history of the Japan-U.S. relationship, is interesting. It reflects both the strengths and some of the difficulties. The first gift of Japanese cherry trees to the United States came from the city of Tokyo. When they arrived in 1910, they were found to be infected with insects and nematodes, and they were all destroyed. After an eloquent and apologetic note of explanation from the American Secretary of State, a replacement shipment arrived in 1912, in March, a little over a century ago. And the first Cherry Blossom Festival took place in Washington in 1934 during the depths of the Great Depression. And later, for the duration of the war between Japan and the United States, the festival was suspended. But a few years later, in 1948, the cherry trees along the Arakawa River here in Tokyo were dying. And they were the stock from which the American plants had come 3 decades before. And so the United States sent budwood back to Japan to restore the Japanese trees here. So it has been with the U.S.-Japan relationship. Difficulties, incidents along the way, but they've been overcome by the persistent efforts of Japanese and Americans. Assistance and cooperation have flowed in both directions across the Pacific, and the results have been an inspiring story of beauty and of renewal. So in the spring of 2014, we face a set of difficult challenges to the Japanese-American relationship. And it's the obligation of all of us who are dedicated to strengthening that relationship to understand them and to work together to overcome them. There are trends within both countries that threaten the renewal of our relationship to meet future challenges. In the United States, popular support for a role of active international leadership is currently on the wane. Many believe that American involvement in Iraq, in Afghanistan, has been both expensive in lives and in dollars. It's provided little benefit. And there's a reluctance to take on new international obligations, a tendency to look carefully at supporting existing obligations. In addition to this popular sentiment, there's a discussion among the foreign policy elites about a different approach to international relations. The proponents of this school argue that in the 21st century, traditional nation-state elements of power are not as effective as they were in the past. Global finance, global business, global information and media, global challenges like the environment are seen as important as the power and influence of the traditional nation-state system. Therefore, traditional uses of diplomacy and military force are neither effective nor necessary in supporting national interests. Now, the proponents of these views have not worked out just how to control and use these new levers of the 21st century world that they described, but they are casting doubt on the more traditional security activities. At the same time, in Japan, while Abenomics have given Japan a needed boost, the previous extended period of economic stagnation has resulted in both a complacency and an inward focus by some. Many Japanese feel that 20 years of slow growth or no growth have not changed their personal lives. They remain safe, comfortable. Events in the rest of the world seem not to have affected Japan, and Japanese interest in competing with or even learning more about the world seems to have flagged. At the political level, there's opposition to the idea that Japan needs to change its traditional national security approach, despite a more powerful and aggressive China and a still unpredictable nuclear North Korea. Careful and passive policies seem to have succeeded in the past, so why change them? And finally, in both of our countries, there's a generational dimension. Much of the strength of the US-Japan relationship has grown out of our history. It's anchored in memories of World War II, the experience of the Cold War. Those who are 30 years old or younger have no personal experience of either. Their personal understanding of world events includes 9/11, 3/11, relatively small but frequent wars in distant places, economic booms and busts at home, global technology, the internet, social media, but few real security threats. So there's work to be done by those of us who believe that the US-Japan relationship forms a cornerstone of future security of both countries, and that both countries must continue to develop the sinews of military, diplomatic, economic skill and capability in order to be successful. Now, I've described some of the negative trends in our two countries, but there are also strong positive signs. The American rebalance to the Pacific, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Initiative, a recognition of the importance of this part of the world. In addition, they are positive, effective steps to strengthen the American connection with East Asia, and especially with Japan, our most important ally here. Events elsewhere, turmoil in the Middle East, President Putin's moves in Eastern Europe, they draw American attention away from East Asia. However, American leaders all understand that the economic and security center of the world will increasingly be located here. And so must American attention and American influence. The Trans-Pacific Partnership promises both to increase prosperity among its signatories and also to draw them closer together politically. It will also pave the way for the long-sought free trade area of the Asia-Pacific, open to all those who meet the TPP's high standards. This includes Korea, which is certainly ready and has support for membership among most of the current countries in the negotiation, as well as China, which has shown increasing interest in joining the TPP as a means of continuing and renewing its economic reform. Here in Japan, on the positive side, the current government is pursuing active and energetic policies across a wide range of issues after years of passivity. In the security area, this year's increase in the defense budget after years of decline is welcome, and it will support Japan's well-established defense obligations. The Prime Minister's introduction of Abenomics was a bold initiative. The first two arrows launched by Mr. Abe have successfully pushed Japan out of deflation, and we all hope that the third arrow will be just as daring, placing Japan on a sustained path of growth by fostering investment and opening up formerly closed areas of Japan's economy to greater competition, including competition from other countries like the United States, where international companies, especially in the service area, would like to bid for business. So there are positive, active initiatives being taken by both our governments to strengthen our relationship. And those of us who believe that the Japan-US alliance is the basis for peace and prosperity in this part of the world, and therefore in much of the globe, need to support these positive moves, overcome the negative trends. And I'm convinced that with this effort, the best days of this alliance are ahead of it. Right now, much commentary on the alliance by security experts concentrates on the details and timing of different documents. Japan is deciding on changes in the interpretation of its constitution. There are revisions to Japan's National Defense Program guidelines, the Japan-US Defense Guidelines, the bilateral coordination mechanism. One would be forgiven for believing that our challenges could all be met by lawyers reviewing documents. But I believe we need to rise above parsing individual documents to understand the more fundamental security trends that are being played out in East Asia and around the globe, and the more fundamental principles that are at stake. when we examine the facts closely, we can be very positive about the future. The most important security trend in East Asia is the rise of China. China is developing at an unprecedented scale and speed. And along with suppressed resentment of a century of humiliation, China is seeking to right what it considers a series of past injustices, and by economic, diplomatic, military pressure, perhaps even military action, to regain territory it sees as wrongfully taken from it. With a model of authoritarian government, economic growth, China is seeking to challenge the idea that democracy and free market capitalism represent the best models for economic and political governance. For their part, the United States and Japan insist on peaceful means for settling territorial disputes, believe that democracy and free markets offer the best protection for human rights and the best potential for human prosperity. And these stark differences between China on the one hand, United States, Japan, European countries on the other, these stark differences seem to lend support to those who compare our era to the time before World War I, the time that those Japanese cherry trees first came to the United States. They argue that fundamental challenges to the world order only happen through war, and that military conflict is somehow inevitable between China and the United States and perhaps allies like Japan. However, to me, the differences between the early 20th and the early 21st century and the lessons of that time are much more striking than are the similarities. First, we need to put the relative economic position of China and the rest of the world into perspective. Although China's GDP, measured in exchange rate terms, has passed that of Japan, it is a little over a third of the combination of the American and the Japanese GDPs. It's a little over a fifth the size of the combination of American, Japanese, and European GDPs. Now, for comparison's sake, in 1914, although Germany had surpassed England in GDP, when World War broke out, the combined GDP of the Central Powers, Germany, Austro-Hungary, was about a third that of the Allies. When the United States entered the war, it was a fifth. It's difficult for any rational Chinese leader to conclude that his country has a decisive political and military advantage over a combination of potential adversaries that would oppose military aggression. Second, and more important, unlike Germany in the early 20th century, China has a huge domestic economic challenge that it continues to face. China has accomplished the greatest poverty reduction program in history by bringing hundreds of millions of its citizens out of poverty. All of us admire this tremendous achievement. However, there are still today almost 500 million Chinese living on less than $2 a day. And the most pressing objective of China's leadership is to continue the economic expansion to benefit those citizens. Chinese per capita GDP is right at the world median, about $6,750 US. Returning to 20th century comparisons, China is less like Imperial Germany and more like Imperial Russia in 1914. At that time, Russia had a per capita GDP of about $1,500, which was just about at the world average. The strains of war on Russia exacerbated the economic and political tensions that already existed within that country. They resulted in its defeat and the fall of the Russian monarchy. Even more important, China knows that to continue its economic miracle, it needs a peaceful and a cooperative rest of the world. When Germany forgot that lesson and allowed events in Sarajevo to pitch it into war against a superior coalition of countries, its imports and its exports were cut off. Its economy withered, it lost a grinding war, and its authoritarian form of government was brought down. So if Chinese leaders take any lessons from the beginning of the last century, and I believe they do, it is that aggression and conflict by rising powers that are still relatively poor and politically developing and dependent on the outside world for prosperity are dangerous gambles that historically have often resulted in the loss of both wars and of governments. On the other hand, going back further than a century into history, we need to remember the wisdom of the Greek historian Thucydides, who explained that countries go to war for three reasons: honor, fear, and interest. The modern historian Donald Kagan has explained that the concept of honor that Thucydides used includes deference, esteem, just due, regard, respect, or prestige. These considerations are very important in Chinese thinking and actions, as they are in many countries. Japan went to war in 1941 in large part because of honor. It went to war against an overwhelmingly superior adversary, the United States. Japanese should understand especially well how these considerations can overcome detached, cold-blooded calculations of relative power and drive a country to military action. So the United States and Japan need to take account of Chinese honor, its ambition to right past wrongs. We need to understand the Chinese expectation that they be given deference that they believe they have earned by their remarkable economic progress of recent years. This does not mean that we cede territory to China or that we give up on our insistence on the resolution of differences by peaceful means, but it does mean that we pursue continual dialogue with China. It means devising new ways and renewing existing offers to settle old grievances, be they events of past wars or disputed territories. It's not enough for the United States simply to say that China must follow the international rules. It's not enough for Japan to say simply that it has already apologized for military actions in China in World War II. We must continue to look for ways to continue to bring China into the global economic and security systems and to give it a role in maintaining those systems for the common good. And fortunately, for opportunity for mutual understanding is much wider and much deeper in the 21st century than it was in the 20th and earlier. Officials, businessmen, academic professionals, reporters, ordinary citizens in the United States, Japan, and China all have much greater access to one another than ever before. There is the opportunity for a nuanced understanding of each other's countries, societies, economies, and political systems that can form the basis for wise policies and practical solutions for differences. Two-way trade of roughly $350 billion means a large number of Japanese and Chinese businessmen are coming into contact with one another all the time. Two-way trade of $570 billion means a large number of American and Chinese businessmen are coming into contact with each other. A recent poll highlighted that the political tensions with Japan were making it more difficult for Chinese businessmen to deal with Japanese firms. However, the consistent advice of businessmen in all three countries to their government is to control political confrontations so that mutually beneficial trade can continue. Virtually all the major universities in the United States and Japan have conferences and joint research projects with their counterparts in China. It's easy to find scholarly articles on all aspects of both the bilateral and the trilateral relationships. Student exchanges among the three countries is also large. 235,000 Chinese students in the United States, an aggressive program in America to have 100,000 young Americans studying in China in the near future. The number of Japanese students studying abroad has declined in recent years, but seems to be rebounding recently. The government of Japan has a goal to double the number of Japanese students who study abroad, currently 60,000, and to bring 300,000 foreign students to Japan by 2020, which would more than double the 130,000 approximately who are studying here now. And finally, in addition to frequent governmental interactions at all levels, there are literally hundreds of professional exchanges, doctors with doctors, lawyers with lawyers, local officials with local officials. And there's a sort of shadow government web of Track 2 conferences, both bilateral and trilateral, among retired government officials, both civil and military, who can have discussions and make recommendations that are less formal, more imaginative than those that can happen in official channels. So all of this contact and mutual dependence places a constraining force on either aggressive military moves by China or aggressive military responses by Japan and the United States. It not only motivates all three governments to de-escalate, to negotiate solutions to crises if they do occur, but it motivates governments to seek long-term compromises that will prevent crises from occurring. So there are many important forces that are restraining aggressive actions. And motivation to continue competition, to confine competition to the diplomatic, the economic sector, and to use soft power rather than hard power to reach political objectives. However, these forces also take place within the context of geography and military balances of power. And the United States and Japan have to take action to maintain these balances in the face of China's rise. For China, until the mid-1990s, military modernization was the fourth of four modernizations behind the development of agriculture, industry, science, and technology. When I would talk with Chinese military leaders in those years, it was quite clear that they were not receiving the budget resources that they felt they needed to modernize. However, as Chinese economic development continued, the Chinese government had the budget resources to allocate to the People's Liberation Army. They have increased those allocations roughly 10% per year for the last 15 years, and that gives China, the PLA, the scope to increase the quality, the quantity of their forces across the board. The PLA has reformed its doctrine, upgraded its personnel, allocated its budget to favor its maritime, air, missile, and space forces, and it has expanded its operation to the east and to the south. Back when I was Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Command, the United States and Japan could, with relatively little effort, control the sea and airspace right up to China's coast. Now China has deployed formidable forces in this area and can contest control of sea and airspace out for hundreds of miles. But we have to keep China's military growth in perspective. Side-by-side comparisons are misleading, but they are a useful starting point for comparing military power balances. The United States and Japan together spend over 3 times as much on their defense as the highest estimate of Chinese defense expenditure. U.S. naval forces and Japanese naval forces not only outnumber China's, but qualitatively they are far superior. U.S. and Japanese advanced aircraft are greater in number than China's. However, the Chinese defense budget increases are continuing, whereas American defense budget is declining, and Japan has turned slightly upward after years of decline. So even as we pursue dialogue with China, seeking win-win compromises to the issues that divide us, we have to offset growing Chinese military power. It must continue to be clear to Chinese leaders that military coercion will not be effective, because military conflict will cause great economic disruption, military casualties, and no victory. Some of the losses will be borne by those that China attacks, if there is war. But more will be inflicted on Chinese forces, and the consequences will be devastating for Chinese economic and social development, and for the position of China's government within the country. Now, prudent preparations do not mean that the United States and Japan seek to contain China or to deny China the respect and power that China has earned from its achievements. These achievements and power will translate inevitably into political influence and in greater deference to China's interests. However, those achievements do not justify bullying international behavior, much less unopposed military aggression to take territory that has for years been inhabited or administered by other countries. So the United States and Japan must increase their own military power in the region to offset China's military modernization and to set the conditions for peaceful settlement of issues with China. Part of that increase must be in resources. I've mentioned the welcome increase in Japan's defense budget, and Secretary Hagel on his recent trip here announced further moves of American naval combatants to Japan. However, there is more to military effectiveness in an alliance than numbers of forces. In order to enhance deterrence of military aggression in East Asia, Japan and the United States need to modernize their ability to cooperate with their military forces in combined and effective task groups, especially at sea and in the air. The current concepts and regulations for combined operations date from the Cold War and are based on the United States coming to the assistance of Japan in case of large-scale attack by the Soviet Union. The scenario was singular, plans were very rigid, and the constitutional and political guidance could be quite simple. Moreover, with the tight constraints on Japan's military actions, these restrictions reassured a region that harbored memories of Japan's actions in the 1930s and in World War II. But the laws and procedures of the past did not envision today's Japan, which for the more than 75 years since 1945 has been the most restrained and exemplary major nation in support of international peace. The procedures of the past did not envision today's situation in which both Japan and the United States are dealing with the possibility of regional aggression by China and North Korea under very dynamic political conditions, when either Japan and its forces or American forces might be threatened. Japanese-American unity of purpose and action will probably be the single most important factor in whether a crisis can be contained and de-escalated or not. And it must be clear to all that Japanese and American forces can operate together in mutual support with the mission of defending both Japanese and American forces and territory. Reinterpreting Japan's Constitution, updating the Japan-U.S. defense guidelines will not result in a more aggressive Japan. If Japan reinterprets its constitution to permit itself to engage in collective self-defense, a right that is enshrined in the United Nations Charter for all nations, this does not mean that Japanese militarism will somehow reemerge. The Japanese people and their democratically elected and accountable leaders who have made Japan a champion of peace for three-quarters of a century have not, and they will not, support aggression. Mindful both of the failure of their nation's past military expansion and the suffering it caused both to Japan and elsewhere in Asia, the Japanese people are the least likely in the world to undertake military aggression against their neighbors. Rather, the bilateral security framework needs to be updated so that Japan and the United States can maintain the same relative military capability that preserved peace and security in this part of the world for decades, and which allowed the growth of prosperity and the development of more democratic governance here. Those who oppose the careful, deliberate, transparent modernization of this outdated framework of the Japan-U.S. alliance are actually risking peace and security in this part of the world. If they are successful in preventing the modernization of Japan's defense policies and the U.S.-Japan security relations, they will create a power imbalance in the region that will make aggression and conflict more, not less likely. Let me conclude by returning to the cherry blossoms. They have survived in their glory for over a century only because wise and skillful gardeners have taken care of them, pruning to keep them healthy, replacing individual trees as they died, bringing in new stock that is more able to withstand new stresses of their environment. These measures required the cooperation and the efforts of gardeners and citizens in both Japan and the United States. And so it must be with the Japan-American alliance. We must be mindful of the past, but not prisoners of the past. While preserving what is valuable to our citizens, we must modernize our societies, our economics, our security policies, and our forces to meet new international conditions. And I am confident that working together we can do so. Thank you very much.